one of the first things we did was simply ask people who use porn or their partners, how was that porn use impacting them in their lives? How is it impacting them personally? How is it impacting their partner? How is it impacting their relationships? And overwhelmingly, people told us that it wasn't really impacting them, which was kind of an interesting issue. And then when people did identify impacts, they tended to be more positive sorts of things than negative sorts of things. So they would talk primarily about how porn use is useful for generating ideas for sexual exploration and experimentation, how porn was useful in helping them improve their sexual communication with their partners.
Dr. Kahoot, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. So you did a study, you've done a few studies I've seen on pornography. Dr. Kahoot, what is the general consensus in research? This is like a broad question, but in research on pornography use right now?
I don't think there is a general consensus. It depends on who you ask. So yeah, ask 12 different researchers, you might get 12 different opinions. This is a topic that's approached by people from various different disciplines. And some people have more, shall we say, sex positive attitudes than others. And in my view, that creeps into their opinions about the state of research. So there are many researchers who feel that there is sufficient evidence to suggest that pornography is a problem for users and for their relationships and for society more generally. There is a body of researchers who feel that that is not the case and not what the research indicates. So it depends on who you ask and what question you're asking about specifically.
Yeah, because I'm starting to find out that it seems to be more nuanced. It really depends a lot, it seems like, on certain factors. So how did you define pornography in this study that we're going to be talking about when it comes to pornography and relationship, how it affects relationship satisfaction?
I've actually written quite a bit about what pornography is as a medium. I spent my PhD focusing on that exact topic. Like, what is it that individuals think that pornography is? Because when you ask, again, different researchers, they have very different opinions about what constitutes porn. And that becomes a major research issue if we're talking about apples and elephants, if we're not comparing the same things across studies, right? So some people will insist that pornography requires the depiction of sexual behavior, explicit sexual behavior. So not what you would see in like a Hollywood movie. Other people say that pornography extends to the depiction of nudity alone. And some people go so far as to say that pornography extends to the suggestion of nudity or behavior. So you can draw the line wherever it is you want to draw the line. Now, in my view, after studying how the average person thinks about this concept, how they make judgments about what is and what is not pornographic, there's a very clear case to be made that depictions of nudity make something seem more pornographic and depictions of sexual behavior make them seem more pornographic. So the more nudity, more sexual behavior you have in a material, the more pornographic it is. And again, in my view, people seem open to calling all sorts of different media representations pornographic, from textual depictions to cartoons to images of real people. So my definition is broad, meaning something that depicts nudity or sexual behavior from any sort of medium, audio, text, video, whatever.
So like even sex, like those books that people read sometimes that has
Those
sexual.
books that people read. Yeah,
Yeah, that'll be.
absolutely. Provided it contains descriptions of nudity and sexual behavior. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's a good point. How would you how was the study designed for specifically for pornography usage and its impact on relationship satisfaction?
You're going to have to walk me back because I've done a couple of those studies. So is there one in
Okay.
particular you want to talk about?
Yeah, this was the one that I reached out for. Okay. So we'll just probably skip over it. Okay, the one where you're talking about like maybe you've done a couple on couples. So I guess we'll just talk
Hmm.
about um couples then in a more general and not this specific this
Well,
specific.
we could walk through a couple examples of research I've done about couples and relationships and just go
Okay,
wherever we go. I'm fine with that.
gotcha. Okay, so let me different questions. So in some of your research on porn usage and how it impacts relationships, sometimes I've seen that you measured like sexual satisfaction, and in one of
Yep.
them you said, yeah, that something that was interesting is in one study you found that men who had higher sexual satisfaction also had more porn usage, which
Hmm.
was interesting. I don't know if you remember that one, but do you remember?
So,
Yeah.
yeah, well, that that could be referring to a couple of different things. So let's just take a couple steps back. Um, One of my first forays into this field occurred because most research, generally speaking, if you measure porn use and you measure sexual satisfaction, most studies on average will indicate more porn use, lower sexual satisfaction. And that's particularly true of men, less true of women. And we don't have a really good handle on why. So, on one hand, we're finding this in study after study after study. But on the other hand, when we ask people how porn use is impacting their lives and ask the partners of porn users how their partner's porn use is impacting their lives, we often get a very different story. And there
Mm.
were hints of that going back about 10 years when we got some money from the Canadian government to do our first set of couples studies. And we thought, okay, well, let's assume that maybe researchers aren't focusing on the right things all the time, and maybe we don't fully understand what's going on. And one of the first things we did was simply ask people who use porn or their partners, how was that porn use impacting them in their lives? How is it impacting them personally? How is it impacting their partner? How is it impacting their relationships? And overwhelmingly, people told us that it wasn't really impacting them, which was kind of an interesting issue. And then when people did identify impacts, they tended to be more positive sorts of things than negative sorts of things. So they would talk primarily about how porn use is useful for generating ideas for sexual exploration and experimentation, how porn was useful in helping them improve their sexual communication with their partners, in part because it helps them connect with what their true preferences and needs are, but also because it makes them less anxious to share things that they might otherwise think are um, abnormal or atypical. Um, and of course, when porn is used together with a partner, a lot of people talk about how that stimulates conversations sort of in the moment or afterwards. Like they use porn use together to be like, oh, that seems interesting. You know, what do you think of that? And so we identified a lot of perceived benefits. One of the prominent perceived negatives in that study was sort of this idea that porn use might decrease interest in sex. Not too many people in that study talked about satisfaction at all. That's it's I don't know, an interesting question mark for me because researchers are hyper focused on measures of relationship satisfaction and sexual satisfaction, but that it's not really a term that the average person bandies about or really thinks too much about.
Right.
They're thinking about other things that are more specific and less
Yeah.
abstract or general. Like it makes me feel bad about my body, or it
Mm.
gives me new ideas for sex. They're not thinking about these global sort of constructs. So, on the basis of that, we did some thinking, and it occurred to us, first of all, that we needed to differentiate between solitary porn use and shared porn use. Because when you look at the way that people talk about the impacts of each of those things, they're very, very different.
Mm.
Very few people said anything negative about shared porn use. Most of the negative things sort of stemmed from perceptions of solitary porn use. Um, and another interesting aspect of that is that when you've got two people in a relationship, right? we often forget that one or both of them can be using porn alone. We often overlook the fact that when we've got porn use in a relationship, it can be in one of a variety of different scenarios. It could be the case that, say, in a heterosexual relationship, the man is using porn alone and the woman is not. That's sort of the stereotype that we all have. But it can also be the reverse. It can be the woman using porn alone, man not. It can be a case where both of them are using porn alone. It could be, well, a case where neither of them are using porn alone, of course. And so when you start thinking in those terms, a couple of interesting things start to percolate up. So we know from a body of research in social psychology that similarity and dissimilarity in people's attitudes, interests, and values is very important for attraction, for how much we like people and want to spend time with them. And
Yeah.
so we find that one of the biggest drivers of who becomes our friends, who becomes our lover, is similarity, is being similar on important sort of personal choices. And I would argue that porn use ranks up there, right? So you might speculate that if partners are dissimilar in their porn use, that they should be having a harder time in their relationship. And that corresponds with a smaller body of research that looks at relationship functioning within romantic relationships and finds that, sure enough, when people are dissimilar in their sexual attitudes, when they're dissimilar in their sexual preferences, when they're dissimilar in their sexual drive, their desire, the couple struggles and has difficulties. And so we thought to ourselves, well, is it the case, perhaps, that part of what we're seeing with respect to porn use and sexual dissatisfaction, maybe it's partly a product of this dissimilarity in use?
Yeah.
And so I suspect one of the studies that you are referring to ties into this notion. And sure enough, when you collect data from both partners, which most researchers don't bother to do, and ask each of them, do you use porn? How often do you use it? You find that it's not really porn use that predicts lower satisfaction. It's dissimilarity in porn use, which is fundamentally important. Now, in the same paper, and this might be what initially prompted this monologue of mine, we found that shared pornography use, whether reported by men or women, is positively correlated with sexual satisfaction. It's positively correlated with relationship satisfaction. It's positively correlated with perceptions of intimacy. It's positively correlated with ease of sexual communication and all of those things. So, the couple that plays together stays together. And
Yeah.
that might be what you're picking up on. So in contrast to most of the research, which traditionally has measured solitary porn use and not taken the steps to measure porn use of both partners, we find very different patterns of results. If you measure solitary porn use separate from shared porn use and also consider what both partners are doing. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm at with that.
So that is beautiful. I think that that added a lot of nuance to my
Yeah,
thoughts
there's a
about
lot to unpack.
lots on back. So what you mentioned that was super interesting is there's a few things. The fact that when you think about it, a lot of people are not thinking about, oh, does porn affect my relationship positively or negatively in general? Because it's there's multiple, it's like a multifaceted
There's
situation.
many mechanisms
Yeah.
of action.
There's many mechanisms of action. And then, like you said, it does make sense to ask more specific questions. Like, does it affect how I view myself and all of these things? So we know that men and women, based off of so many studies and just anecdotally, that men and women seem to use porn at different rates, right?
Different rates and different ways.
And in different ways. Yes, actually, yeah, because reading content, pornographic or sexual content is porn. So, or that's how you're defining it. So how does that come into play in a relationship? Where does it matter, or does it matter the attitude about porn?
Hmm.
I don't know what matters there.
What matters more? What well, there's a ton of things we're still learning. One of the things I usually start off by saying when I give a public lecture about porn is that we've been investigating the impacts of porn on individuals and their close relationships for close to 60, 70 years, and we know almost nothing. One of the things we are absolutely certain of is that there are differences in use between genders. That is pretty bankable. Like I have no qualms about that. I don't think anyone in the field would disagree with that notion. But about almost any other question, we can't reach any sort of clear consensus. So we do see that when studies are poorly conducted, that is, they're not measuring both partners. They're not differentiating between solitary porn use and shared porn use. On average, men's use tends to be negatively correlated with more relationship quality indicators than women's. Women's tends to be uncorrelated. And so there's a lot of speculation about like why is that? And nobody has a really good answer to that question yet. The sort of going hypotheses that I see published are rooted in an assumption that porn itself is changing the way that people think, feel, and behave, right? And consequently, the explanation for the gender difference must be that it's changing the way that men think, feel, and behave in ways that are different than it's changing the way that women think, feel, and behave.
Right.
But I like to think outside the box. And often I don't think about porn as a causal effect in terms of how it's changing the way we are as humans, but try and think about the role it plays in relationships more broadly speaking. And from that perspective, I think, yeah, there's a lot to consider. Attitudes become very, very important, right?
Yeah.
So, a man's attitudes, we have very little data about this, but what we have suggests that men's attitudes towards female partners' porn use tends to be quite positive.
I would think probably that's gonna.
And so you might argue, well, then a woman's porn use will be less disruptive to the relationship, regardless of whether or not it changes the way that women think, feel, and behave. Just the fact that men are more accepting means that there will be fewer fights about it, less attempts to hide it, and so on and so forth. So that is one plausible argument, and there is a little bit of data that supports that notion. Although in our own work, we thought that that might explain what the dissimilarity effect was. We thought it might be rooted in attitude dissimilarity. So it was not the case in our own data. So that is one working hypothesis that takes a slightly different angle. And there's limited support for it, but not in my own research. So that's a possibility. But we really don't know why this is going on, why this is shaping up the way it does, and yeah, what the consequences are. So in my dissimilarity work, we checked to see if dissimilarity was weighted by gender. That is, does it matter that it's the man using porn alone versus the woman using porn alone and having an unusing partner? And it doesn't seem to. It seems to work both ways equally well. And the best statistical explanation of all the different models we tested, the best sort of evidence we have gathered is that it seems to be rooted in our data in differences in sex drive. So if you account for the fact that men on average have a higher sex drive than do women on average, then you tend to find no effects of porn use, similar, dissimilar, any use, whatever, on the relationship. It seems to be a marker for differences in sex drive. So that's a totally other way to take it too, that there are very clear differences in men and women's desire for sexual interaction and their motives for sexual interaction. And maybe that is what porn use seems to be tapping. So it may have nothing to do with the porn at all. We don't know. Lots of
I,
questions.
so basically, so you guys saw that guys who, okay, let me just unpack that one a little bit. The guys you said, like, guys on average
Yeah.
have sex drive. And in in a scenario where you have an average guy, you have an average girl, higher porn usage with a guy is not going to is are you saying it's not going to create any?
No, what I'm saying is we know that dissimilarity in sex drive causes problems in relationships. It's like one of the number
That's what
one
I'm saying.
complaints
Yeah.
when it comes to sexual aspects of a relationship. It's usually disagreements about the how often and the what. And very often it is the male partner in relationships that wants more. Not to say that it always is. There are certainly relationships that go the other way, but that seems to be a factor. And we know that sex drive is correlated with porn use. So people who have a high sex drive use more porn.
Oh, so it could just
So it could be what we're seeing could be in part a function of differences in sex drive. Now the really curious sort of thing is that there are statistical base rate differences, as you pointed out, by gender in things like porn use and like I just said, in sex drive. So a couple of years ago, while I was working on this at first, I had this awesome thought in the shower. I thought to myself, okay, well, if you picked a couple and you knew that the man was using porn in the relationship, a heterosexual couple, what would be the probability that his female partner is also using porn in the relationship? You want to guess?
um I would be so off. I'm guessing. Okay, wait. If we're talking about visual porn, I would think it's low. I would think it's
Just any porn.
oh, if you're talking about read material that you can read, high. Like if he's using porn, maybe like 50% of the time.
Not a terrible guess. So like I thought about 35%, and across the studies I've done, it works out to be about 40%.
Okay.
Not to say that I necessarily have the most generalizable samples, but as best as I can tell, about 40%. It's a little less than half. And now reverse that scenario. So you pick a heterosexual couple in which you know the woman is using porn. What is the probability that her male partner is using porn?
Maybe 80.
Yeah. No, it's like about 90%.
Oh,
It's about 90%. So it's high. Now, when you put those two facts together, what you start to recognize is that on average, when you're talking about male porn use in relationships, they're with a partner who is not using porn on average.
on that.
But on average, in fact, almost certainly, when you're talking about women's porn use, their partner is using porn. So one
Okay.
possible explanation, again, for this gender difference in satisfaction might simply boil down to base rates of similarity and difference that are a function of gender. If all the time, well, not all the time, well, if all the time women's porn use is in the context where their male partners using porn, that should not be disruptive to the relationship. They should have similar attitudes, similar opinions, similar sex drives, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right. And so you wouldn't expect it to be related to their sexual satisfaction or relationship satisfaction at all. And that is indeed what we find. Like that's what the literature tends to see. Women's porn use is not related to these relationship consequences. On the other hand, if men's porn use typically is occurring in contexts where their partner is not using porn, then it is potentially disruptive. Then you've got potential differences in attitudes, you've got potential differences in sex drive, you've got more attempts perhaps by the male partner to hide their use, and so on and so forth. And so it may all, yeah, it may all come back to, well, why is it that we have a gender difference in the first place in porn use? And maybe that's why we're seeing a gender difference in the quote unquote effects of porn use on relationships.
Yeah, so when you would talk to a lot of couples, what were you were saying that a lot of times the guys would say they're satisfied, and a lot of times the women would say like they're there's no effect really, like
Hmm.
porn
Hmm.
has no real effect. So, uh, does it make a difference if they're Christian? Does is there any other factors that are there other factors that change the answer?
Oh, 100%. Exactly kind of what you're suggesting and thinking. Now, this is outside the realm of what I research, but others have done a fairly good job delving into this recently, and it connects to this popular notion of porn addiction. So,
A lot of that,
um,
they say there's a lot of
yeah,
talk porn addiction.
yeah, and it's actually it's terrifying a lot of people, and it is contributing actually to a lot of contemporary legislation trying to restrict porn access, particularly to minors, out of fear that it will cause some sort of sexual dysregulation in their minds and lead to lives of hardship. There are other reasons, of course, that this legislation is being implemented, but like you see that addiction theme pop up in a lot of these conversations. Now, we do not have a good handle on porn addiction. There's a huge debate about whether or not porn addiction is in fact an addiction. Same with sex addiction. There are some people that swear up and down that it is no different from a substance dependence issue, and that porn changes the neural circuitry of your brain in such a way that it's not differentiable. There are other people, including some neuroscientists, who completely reject that notion based on the available evidence. Um, some of us that sit more towards the middle think that there might be several issues at play that manifest in the same apparent behaviors, but for very different underlying reasons. And so it could be that porn addiction is not one thing, but a collection of things that seem from the outside to be the same thing, but are in fact very different things. And one of the possible underlying causes has been sort of attributed to a theory called moral incongruence theory, and it's been popularized by Josh Grubbs in the US. And it stemmed from an observation of his that porn addiction seems to be abnormally prevalent among fundamentalist Christians. Despite the fact that we know that fundamentalist Christians use less porn on average than do non-fundamentalist Christians. Yeah.
Yeah.
And what was happening in anecdotal experiences among clinicians is that people would come into their office and say they're struggling with their porn use, and the clinician would ask, well, how much porn are we talking about? And they'd be like, well, like I looked at it last year. And the clinician would be like, okay, why do you think you're addicted to porn? And so one of the best sort of criteria or most universal criteria for identifying any sort of addiction is people's perception that they lack control over their behavior, right? That is sort of the root universal indicator. There's a lot of other aspects that go hand in hand with that, but that's the one that is common, I think, to all approaches of addiction. And the funny thing about that is there can be a lot of reasons that one feels like they cannot control their behavior, even in light of evidence that they clearly are controlling their behavior.
Right.
And so Grubbs did some thinking, and it occurred to him that maybe for some individuals, they are attracted to the use of porn. They have built-in psychological mechanisms that make it seem appealing and desirable, but
Mhm.
they have a value system that is inconsistent with that behavior. And in those cases, you're now stuck in this state of motivational tension between two opposing desires or needs. And you're going to feel a lot of anxiety about that. If you go one way, if you go towards porn, you have a lapse in your control. You feel a lot of guilt about that. You worry that it's going to happen again, and you have this perception that you have difficulty managing and controlling your behaviors. And sure enough, he's been pumping out research for almost a decade now, suggesting that, at least among a certain segment of society, perceptions of porn addiction are fundamentally rooted in a value system rather than the porn use per se. So it's where, values meet behavior. And this model is identical to the model of cognitive dissonance developed by Leon Festinger and is like a staple of social psychology 101. Um, yeah, people are uncomfortable when they realize that their attitudes don't conform to their behavior, and it causes them a lot of distress until they either change their behavior or change their attitudes. So yeah, religion plays a very big role. Anecdotally, talking to clinicians in couples therapy and sex therapy, I hear a lot of stories about couples coming in where a partner is complaining about the other person's porn use. So that's a case where the partner's attitudes are judging a behavior as problematic and creating the problem. And often that stems from religious points of view, not always, but like often. Um, I've told Grubbs, I think a couple times, that like his theory could be expanded to other worldviews as well. Like I have talked
Yeah,
to many
just
people.
thinking of you.
Um, uh, People disclose all sorts of fun and interesting things about their lives to me when they find out what I do. And one of the things I've heard from multiple women is that they struggle with their desire to use porn or specific types of porn when it contradicts their feminist values, their perceived feminist values. And so I have definitely met people that sound exactly like the Christian fundamentalist who are like, I'm doing this and I don't like that I'm doing it. And I lose a lot of sleep over it. What should I do about it? Um, so yeah, values definitely play a role here, I think.
Values play a massive role here. So with couples, who did you find and were there couples that you found that are there couples that you find that tend to benefit from porn? And
There are
what are
couples
the
that there are couples that tell us they benefit from porn, and what are the benefits? Is that your question?
they tell you? Yeah, yeah. That's a good catch that this is what they tell you. Yes, and yeah, what are the traits that go?
Yeah. So this is one of those things where my critics would say you can't trust what people tell you because often people will come up with cognitions to justify inappropriate behavior. Like if you, for example, like talk to child predators, like why did you do this? They'll have to tell you, well, like the kid wanted it, right?
Right.
And there's nothing wrong with what I did. So you have to be careful with the reasons or the justifications people provide with their behavior. I think we can't ignore them either. Like there's a wealth of information that we risk missing if we don't think about it. But we do always have to consider it with a critical eye. So yeah, in terms of things that people often talk about as a benefit to themselves or to the relationship, they're often rooted in improved sexual comfort, reduced sexual anxiety. So this understanding that you're not so weird, there are other people like you out in the world, and the world's full like a spectrum, a rainbow spectrum of sexual desires and interests, and everyone has their place. Um, so there's that. There is it's often used actually particularly by sexual minority individuals in the sort of coming out process themselves, sort of recognizing their identity and realizing, oh, I really like looking at hard dicks. I guess I'm gay. Um, that's part of increasingly part of sort of the journey towards self-identification in the coming out process. Um, Within couples, like I mentioned, communication is a big one people talk about a lot. And again, that's rooted in more comfort in sexual communication and more comfort in disclosing personal interests to a loved one. But also partly because it acts as a catalyst for conversation. It's something that you can talk about without really fully revealing yourself. Like you can be like, oh, that's kind of gross.
Okay.
without, putting it on your partner or yourself, or like, oh, I think that's really hot. And it can be really non-specific. And then if the partner judge or responds like, oh yeah, I think so too, then you can, go a little bit further about what it is you like. So communication's a big piece when porn is used together, but arguably, like some of our data suggests that people think it helps even when they use it alone to understand themselves and become more prepared to disclose that information to a partner. When you do have sexual conversations about personal sexual likes and dislikes, if it occurs with a partner who responds with like warm, positive regard, who's supportive, or even like reciprocates it, like, oh, I love that too. One byproduct of that is that you feel closer to that person. You feel like you can trust them more. You feel more cared for by them, more understood, more validated by them, and you feel closer, more intimate with them. So within the context of porn use together, people often do talk about how it brings them closer to their partner, how it increases their intimacy. And there is another aspect that comes up a lot too, this idea of sexual open-mindedness. So it opens other avenues of thinking and tolerance that participants feel like they didn't have before they started watching porn. So it makes them more sexually open-minded and tolerant of other people's behaviors. There are other like more niche things that come up more rarely. Like occasionally we'll see from women this idea that it makes them feel more agentic or capable of controlling the sexual dynamics in their relationship, being able to ask specifically for what they want and tell their partner specifically what they don't want and lead the situation rather than following the traditional heterosexual script where men take control. That's more rare, but it does pop up from time to time too. So I think those are probably the big ones. Like occasionally some people will say things like, it helps bridge a sexual desire discrepancy. There were a couple people in one of our studies who said things like, I'm on a medication that is known to suppress sexual desire. And so sometimes I use porn on days where I want to have sex with my partner to get me into the mood. And then I go have sex with my partner. Again, that's a much less common narrative, but it's arguably seen as a functional or boon aspect of porn.
I'm wondering, like you said, you always have to be careful of what people tell you. But I'm
Mhm.
wondering if they have a certain personality type to begin with, maybe like they might be more I don't know what they call sex positive or
Yep, yep, yep. So I'm glad you brought that up because we've been talking about correlational research and descriptive research. So descriptive research meaning like what do people say is going on? Correlational research meaning we measure one variable, porn use, we measure another variable, sexual satisfaction. How do those variables relate? And the problem with those types of studies, correlational studies, is that it could be that porn use is causing lower sexual satisfaction, or it could be that people who are sexually dissatisfied seek out porn use to augment their need for sexual interactions. Or it could be that there's some other factor that drives both porn use and low sexual satisfaction. So you raise the interesting question, like, are porn users different from non-users? Fuck yes. Fundamentally different in many different ways. And that could be in part because porn use changes people, or it could be in part because different types of people are more comfortable to seek out porn than others. And so among the variables that are most commonly differentiate porn users and non-users is obviously gender, which we've talked about before. One of the biggest differences actually in sexuality, there are very few large gender or sex differences in sexuality. One of the ones that is pretty stable is porn use. It's one of the biggest ones. But aside from that, there are two factors. One you've already drawn attention to, sex positivity, which is having a positive view of sex combined with a tolerance of sexual diversity. provided that sex happens within a context of consent. So sex positivity is mostly about having positive and accepting attitudes towards a wide range of sexualities and genders. Porn users are more sex positive than non-users, on average. Erotaphilia, erotophobia is similar to, but somewhat different than. So erotaphilia, erotophobia is a personality dimension that differentiates people's approach or avoidance of sexual cues. So people who are erotophilic approach sexuality. People who are eρωτophobic avoid sexuality, and it's tied to automatic emotional reactions to presentations of nudity, of sexual behavior, of innuendo that refers to either one of those things. Some people get an immediate ick factor, and some people are like, that's interesting. I would like
Okay.
to know more. And that's different from sex positivity, and that it has really nothing to do with tolerance, although people who are erotophilic tend to be more sex positive. Now, erotophilia, erotophobia really differentiates who uses porn and who doesn't. It also, incidentally, differentiates among new mothers who breastfeeds and who doesn't, as well as who is more likely to use condoms, who is not, and a variety of other things. So erotophilia, erotophobia is a big factor in differentiating porn users from non-users, and has a lot of other health implications as well. So erotophilia, erotophobia, sex positivity, age. So we've studied adolescents, we've studied adults, and what we tend to see is that from around the age of 10 upwards, you see an increasing porn use up to early 20s, and then it starts to decline again. So there's a curvilinear effect of age.
Is that for men and women, or is that for like
That's,
pornography?
as far as we can tell, it's for men and women, although the upward tick starts earlier in boys than it does in girls. So
And that's is that for visual pornography
uh,
mostly?
I can't say for certain, but I would gather this is a sort of a amalgam summary across many different studies that have defined porn differently, and most studies stick more to visual representation. Yeah, that description I think it'd be safer to say that's rooted more in visual or pictorial descriptions of porn.
So it's that okay. So when you're like as young as 10,
Yep.
and then it drops like college around
Yeah,
almost when.
yeah. Shortly after college, it starts to decline. Not like tremendously, but it does decline. So if you have a sample of only adults, you'll find a negative correlation. Older you are, less porn use. But if you have a sample of adolescents, you'll find a positive correlation. I have yet to see. I don't think there is a longitudinal study that has traced porn use with the same sample of people throughout their life. That does not exist yet, as far as I know. That would be the sort of data we need to have to be absolutely sure. But across many different studies, we always see a positive correlation in youths, negative correlation in adults, which means it's got to be peaking in the 20s.
I
Right?
did want to ask you something because I found
Yeah.
this interesting in some of your work. So I noticed, you studied the isolated people who use porn and you studied the shared people who use porn. And
Yeah.
obviously, people that share their porn usage, in a relationship will have they're gonna have better outcomes. I think for
Hmm.
a few reasons. One, they felt comfortable enough to share it, so that's a sign that something good is going on. They must have
Hmm.
known they were going to get a positive response. But with the isolation one, what was interesting is that there's a lot of couples who watch it by themselves. Like I think the
Hmm.
other one, no. Can you talk a little bit about that? I wonder if there's if they have a
Yeah.
positive um
Well, yeah, going back to the way I sort of map things out, you can use it alone. Within a relationship, you can have one partner using it alone, the other partner using it alone, or both partners using it alone. And yeah, our data suggests that in cases where both partners are using it alone, the couple looks no different from relationships in which no one is using porn.
Oh,
So
wow.
yeah, it's really only the couples in which one partner is using it and the other partner is not that differ by being in worse quality relationships. So
So
yeah.
It's probably like you said, underlying mechanisms going on more so
Well,
than
it
the
does make you think, right? If it's porn driving, if it's porn changing the way we think, feel, and behave, which causes problems in our relationship, you would not expect that pattern. In fact, you would expect if that was what was causing problems in relationships, then couples in which both partners are using porn alone, they should have the worst outcomes in their relationship. But that is very much not what we see time and time again. We've run this across 3 different fairly large samples of couples. I'm currently collecting an even larger sample of couples. And that's just not what I see. So it does make you think, like, what is actually at play here? Is it about porn causing problems, or is it the porn itself that is the problem? Or does it reflect some other underlying difference?
right. Okay. Wow. If it is some underlying difference, it makes life so much harder for a lot of people because
Yeah, well, absolutely. And that's not to say, like, there's hundreds, thousands of couples where they are unhappy because of porn use in their relationship. So it's not to dismiss those cases. I'm talking on a scale even larger than that. That does not seem to be the most common reason that there are problems in a relationship because of porn from the data that I have seen. Um, but yeah, that does happen, right? Like we talked about, attitudes play a role here. Um, but yeah, so like when you've got a couple where both partners are using porn alone, very often I suspect both partners know about each other's porn use.
they probably do.
They don't. They probably don't know when it's happening necessarily, or what is being used, but they're probably aware. They've probably had the conversation, like, "Oh yeah, I use porn. Oh yeah, I use porn too. Cool." And they're fine to leave it at that. They just treat it as a separate thing. Now, one question, I guess I have is like, why do you do that in a case where you could just be using porn with your partner? And we don't have a clear answer to that question. My speculation is that it comes back to, like, why do people masturbate even though they have a partner? And best answer we have to that question is like, well, they serve different functions.
Actually, well, of course I can. I'm just gonna ask you a few more questions and then
Yeah.
because I know you probably have to go. Um, Something that I find that I'm interested in is you said that a lot of studies find that women tend to be like there's no issue when she uses porn, like
On
relationship
average. That's not to say that on average, yes.
on average. Is that usually visual porn or is that usually content porn?
Usually, okay. Um, I would love to bore you to death with a paper I wrote about about the measurement problems in this field. These are very good questions. Excellent questions. If you look across studies and within relationships, outside of relationships, just anything to do with porn use, what you are immediately confronted with is that no two researchers define porn the same way, nor do they measure it the same way.
Gotcha. So
So
you can't answer.
we really are very often comparing apples to elephants and trying to make sense of that. And part of what I have been doing is pointing out that, like, maybe the reason that we can't reach consensus is that we're not all talking about the same thing, and we should get maybe on the same page before we go much further. And there's some people have responded positively to that. Many people continue to do what they've always done. I'm not the first person to draw attention to this. Mary Short, back in 2012, pointed it out very clearly, and nothing changed from 2012 to 2020. I re-reviewed all the research that had been published between those 2 points, and we continued to do shitty research. My guess is, just on the basis of what I have read and seen, that more often people are not expansive in the inclusion of written material. Some people do, but more often they're talking about pictures and video.
Okay.
Very often, researchers will not specifically define for their participants what they're asking about. They'll just say, how often do you use porn? Leave it up to the participant to decide what that means, and will not describe in the paper what the researchers themselves think that porn means. And so the most typical approach is to just be completely ambiguous. But among the ones that do offer more clear instructions, it tends to be weighted more towards video and pictures.
Okay. Weighted more towards it. Okay. So I don't know. What would you, okay, I don't know if you have kids, but
I
what
do.
would your advice be like to your son, to your daughter, for if you know, if they get into a relationship and there's, you know, and there's some worry about porn, I don't know. What would be your based off of just looking at the literature? I mean,
Yeah.
your kids are different, but just in
Why are my
what
kids different?
well, you know what I mean? I mean, like maybe your kids are different in terms of like the you know, average porn user, or they're not a good
Hmm.
example. I'm not gonna say your kids. Let's just
Okay.
say um you had to get you were somebody was coming to you about, hey,
Yeah.
um what how should I be thinking about porn? Should I be worried about porn?
Sure. Sure.
What would you say to them?
I've spent a little bit of time with some Croatians working on projects related to porn use among minors. Um, and there's a couple points. If you're coming to me at the point where your kids are already at the point where they're in a relationship and they have a partner that's using porn and it's causing problems, you're coming to me way too late. You should have come much sooner. Um, what parents should be doing with respect to porn and their kids is recognizing that kids that want to use it will use it, and there's nothing that they can do that will stop that. They can do things that will make it harder for them to do it, less frequent, make them hide it more from their parents. But if they want to use it, they will use it. And chances are they're going to be more technologically savvy than you are once they get into their early teens anyway. So accept the inevitable. Number one. Number two, have frank discussions about critical media consumption more generally as you bring them up through life, starting with non-sexual media. And then when they come of age, start shifting that conversation to sexual depictions as you do, whether it's in popular music or movies you're watching on Netflix or whatever, so that they start to think carefully about what it is they're seeing. Like one of the first discussions we had with our kids in this regard is like, you do realize that not everything on YouTube is real life, right?
Not just
Because
too.
wherever they get their media, they were telling us, I can't remember what spawned this conversation, but it was clearly a very hokey conspiracy theory that one of my kids stumbled into on YouTube, and we had a long discussion about like why people say what they say on the internet, what they're trying to gain from it, and what the motives are. And when it comes to porn use, particularly commercial porn, so we can also talk about non-commercial porn, which is a slightly different thing. But with commercial porn, um, they're selling a fantasy. They're not selling real sex. And in fact, if you try and mimic the mechanics of porn sex, just like everything else aside, the sort of subordination of women, the hypersexualization, all of those things aside, and those are things we should talk about. If you just try and mimic their actions, you'll find that the sex is not very enjoyable because it's sex that's made to be filmed, not sex that's made to be enjoyed. Like look very carefully at their positioning, you'll notice that this is not how people have sex. And if you ever try and
A really good
film
point.
yourself having sex, you'll notice like this isn't working. Why does it not look good? And it's because the sex they're having is not real sex. Like it is real sex, but it's not sex for pleasure. It's not an idealized form of sex the way you want to have sex.
You just
But it is a fantasy.
you just explained to a lot of young guys basically
Yeah.
why a lot of women will say, hey, when you know, if you're watching porn and you're trying to imitate that, just don't do
It,
that.
it's not working. It's obviously. And then like
But it's not obvious to a lot of people. I'm just saying, it's not obvious to a lot of.
You'd be surprised. You'd be surprised. So, like, one of the things that terrifies adults is that children are incapable of recognizing this. And when I say children, I mean, teens. But when we ask adolescents, like, what do you think about porn? How real is this? Or they will spontaneously be like, this is obviously fake. It's
Wow.
obviously trumped up. Yeah.
Young, wow.
Like, so, like, we don't give kids enough credit sometimes. Having said that, as a parent, it's your role to make sure that they do recognize that this is fake. And so my advice to parents is to have those conversations early and often and repeatedly. Like sex ed in the home doesn't start when the kid is 12. It should start when they're born. And it should be developmentally appropriate for whatever stage of life they're at. Kids probably start to have sexual interest as early as around 11, 12 years old. That's the number that we sort of peg, and that is coincidentally, or not coincidentally, when porn use starts to creep up. And it has always been that low, like as well, always as far as we have records for. There's this belief that the internet made, porn use started at a much earlier age. That doesn't seem to be the case. Certainly, like, people have much more access to porn than they used to, don't get me wrong, but the kids that want to seek it out start to seek it out when their bodies tell them, like, oh, this is interesting, I want to know more. And that starts as early as 11, 12 years old. So be aware that that's going to happen. You're not going to stop it. The best you can do is mitigate some of the complications of it by critical media training, and by being open and accepting. Like, if you're the type of parent that shuts down sexual conversations when there is a problem with porn, whether it's a partner's porn use, their own porn use, whatever, they're not going to come to you for help when they ought to be able to come to you for help. So you need to be open and accepting and non-judgmental, but also make it clear that this is meant to be a form of entertainment, right? This is not real life. And some people who do it are just terrible human beings. Like, there's some very antisocial porn out there. And some people do it with a great love for humanity and make a very different product. So, yeah,
It's a
things
very,
vary.
yeah, you have to look at it as a product, as part of capitalism.
Yeah.
So I do have two questions actually that came from that. What is non-commercialized porn versus porn? I mean, versus commercialized porn,
Hmm.
and then I did want to just talk about some of the side effects that you've seen of porn that can be negative.
Hmm. So very simply, like, you know who the biggest porn producers are right now in the world? You and me. It's not
People.
it's not the mainstream porn industry. People have the means of production in ways that they have not had in the past, and they are taking advantage of it. So rates of sexting, like, people shit the bed about sexting. Um, they're high. They're ubiquitous, but they're not 100% of teens. But it does start early, like about by the time people get into their early 20s, like 50 to 70% of people have sexted. And sometimes that's just, trading pictures or things they found online. But a lot of that is self-made expressions of sexuality, whether in text or picture or video or what have you. That is just a part of our sexual landscape now, and adults continue that through their lives. And many long distance relationships arguably profit from that because it allows them that channel of sexual intimacy that previously they wouldn't have had access to when they're separated for long periods of time. Um, Certainly, there's risks to sexting, but on average, it's a thing. And as a consequence, there's a huge volume of porn that's produced by people for their lovers that is not, made for commercial purposes. And arguably, those are probably the biggest producers of, non-commercial porn is probably the biggest production mode at this point, just given the number of people doing it. So that's what I mean by non-commercial porn.
Yeah. It's like
Um,
sexting. Like, you don't get paid for it.
yeah,
It's just
yeah, you don't get paid for it. Well, you could get paid for it if you're into that. But yeah, like, there's a lot of that, and people do, like, keep. We don't have a lot of research about this, but I know from, again, anecdotal experience, people do keep pictures of their past relationships. Some people delete them, and there's a lot of ethical debate about the appropriateness of that, and of course, legal issues when people disseminate things that their partner didn't consent to. But yeah, that's a huge new sphere of the pornoscape that didn't exist in the same way 20 years ago, right? So that's one
yeah.
thing. Negative side effects of, not side effects, maybe main effects of porn use.
Oh, okay.
I don't know that there are any clear benefits, and I don't know that there are any clear harms. Now, among the harms that people are most concerned about uh, tends to be this notion of sexual objectification and hypersexualization, which I have both political and research misgivings towards, but that is a concern that many people have. So there are some interesting things about the porn debates. Let's say we could convincingly show, and we can't at present, but let's say we can convincingly show that using porn makes you more sexually tolerant and permissive. Okay. That means you're more tolerant of gay relationships. It means you're more tolerant of sex outside of marriage, like premarital sex, as most of us engage in premarital sex these days. More tolerant of use of sex toys, more permissive. There are scholars like me that would look at that and say, that's a good thing. And then there are scholars and people that are not scholars who look at that and say, that's a terrible thing. So is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, it kind of depends on who you are. And I kind of feel the same way about these discussions of hypersexualization and objectification. There are elements of that research that really are just suggesting that people are becoming more fully sexually present or sexually focused, and I don't necessarily see that as always a bad thing. Certainly, if you make the case that it demeans the object of your attraction in some way, which is the argument that by objectifying them sexually, they're no longer valuable as a non-sexual object. Well, yeah, that might be cause for concern, but that, in my view, is not what the research actually shows. So, like one of the studies I did based in that sort of space looked at porn usage and attitudes towards gender equality. And it turns out in the US, porn users are more positive towards gender equality than non-users. Surprise, surprise. So it doesn't seem to be the case that watching porn makes you think that women shouldn't run for president. In actual fact, porn users are more likely to vote for a female candidate than non-users. So, what are we talking about there? So that's a big one. Another big one is violence. So particularly sexual violence. And I've done quite a bit of work in that regard. I think it's possible, it's plausible, but there's a lot of things we have to rule out first. And one of the early studies we did about this looked at porn use as it correlates to sexual assault against women as reported by men. And what the research had been showing up to that point is that porn use on its own tends not to be correlated with sexual aggression, except among men who are already at risk of sexual aggression. So this is sometimes called the confluence model. So among most men, it's not predictive of sexual aggression, but around 10% of men who are already at high risk of sexual aggression, well, then porn use increases that risk further. Okay.
What constitutes for high risk of?
What are the other risk factors?
Yeah.
Yeah. So in this model specifically, and this is specific again to male violence against women, men who are high in hostile masculinity, which is a personal disposition that involves a hostile and distrustful orientation towards women. Basically men who feel that women are always trying to take advantage of them, that always have an ulterior motive. The incel. The incel is a good example of someone high in hostile masculinity, right? So that's one of the factors. And the other factor is called impersonal sexuality or an impersonal sex. And it is theorized to be somebody who has difficulty forming emotional bonds with people they have sex with. So they don't form caring relationships. They don't much care about what happens with their partners. They lack empathy.
Psychopaths.
Sexual empathy. Yeah, well, one of the predictors of impersonal sex is psychopathy. It's exactly that. So they're a good indicator, or they're one example of somebody who would be high in impersonal sexuality. So when you're high in both of those factors, you are at very high risk as a man for committing acts of sexual aggression, and even more so if you use porn than if you don't. So we published this, I think,
amazing.
Which kind of makes,
yeah,
right? So in 2015, we published a study that confirmed this model, found data that replicated that pattern of findings, but it always bothered me that, again, we're dealing with correlational studies where we don't know if porn use is actually causing that effect or something else might be going on. And even back then, I was thinking, well, we know that porn users are higher in sex drive, okay, than non-users. And if you think about the model, what it's proposing is that you've got these men that dislike women, that don't care what happens to their sexual partners. Okay, if that man is not sexually motivated, if he's asexual, then what's going to happen is that he's not going to be out raping and sexually assaulting women. He's going to be dominating them in the workplace, abusing them in other facets of their life. But if they're high in sexual desire, well, that's a recipe for a rapist, right?
Sure.
And so sure enough, if you rerun that model, but take porn use out and put in sex drive, you get the exact same pattern. And when you put both porn use and sex drive in together, they cancel each other out, meaning they are confounded. So we don't know whether this is a product of sex drive or porn use, or some of the people that disagree with me would say, well, maybe porn use is creating a higher sex drive, which is ultimately causing the problem. Maybe, but we don't know. There seems to be some other factor that is implicated in a way that is difficult to tease out. It could be that porn use is causing a higher sex drive. It could be simply that sex drive is causing the porn use, and therefore it looks like porn use is responsible. We just don't know. So I would say yes, porn use is implicated in sexual assault. I think the evidence for that is reasonably clear. I find it in my own data. Why it's implicated in sexual assault, we don't know. Is it causing sexual assault? It's not clear. And one of the set of studies I'm still working on right now is trying to tease apart as best we can what role porn is actually playing. So that's another major one. A big one that people are concerned about, sexual risk taking. So is porn use making people less likely to use condoms, making them more likely to have more sexual partners, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The body of research in general seems to indicate that, yes, more porn use is associated with higher sexual risk taking, but the quality of those studies is very poor. And the higher quality studies, the ones that are longitudinal, that make predictions about future behavior rather than what's happened to me up until this point in my life, which is what most studies do, cross-sectional studies. Longitudinal studies are less likely to find that link. The ones I did with the Croatians basically found no links among adolescent porn use and their sexual risk taking, or very inconsistent links. So I would say it's something going on there. Well, speaking of factors that correlate with porn use, sociosexuality, which we didn't talk about. Sociosexuality is a disposition towards wanting to be in a monogamous relationship versus wanting to be in as many relationships as you can at any one time and in your lifetime. So high sociosexuality, unrestricted sociosexuality, you're into orgies and as many partners as you can get. It's not so much about the frequency of sex, although that's a part of it. It's more about the number of partners. That on its own is a risk, sexual risk behavior, having multiple partners. Porn users are higher in sociosexuality. We don't know if that's because porn use is causing sociosexuality, or if people who are high in sociosexuality for many reasons are more comfortable and interested in watching porn because it exposes them to more partners, at least in their fantasy minds. We don't know. And so for each of these concerns that we have, I think they're valid concerns. They deserve a lot of research attention and focus, but they're muddy. And the same goes for any of the benefits we've talked about. Like, they're equally muddy, sometimes for the exact same reason, sometimes for very, very different reasons. So yeah, going back to that point I made earlier, 60, 70 years of research, and what do we fucking know? I don't know. It keeps me busy, but it makes it difficult to say hard and fast, we need to be worried about this, or we need to promote this. Like, I don't know where to put the money.
I know. It just seems like it's much more complicated, and it almost seems like your intuition is going to play a big role in determining, okay, this is probably more what's going on, this is probably more what's going on. But let me try to sum up what I'm getting for the most part.
Yeah,
It's
sure.
complicated. It's very complicated, and there's a lot of underlying mechanisms that could be going on that could explain a lot of the main effects of porn in many ways. But it when it comes to, for example, people who have some sort of hostility towards women, like for example, people that have that, when you put porn in, it seems like it increases, violence towards women, but it could also, but you said also when you exchange it for sex drive, when you just test it for sex drive, it's the same result. So it seems like porn can be like porn could be what's causing a lot of things, but it can also be just a cue for your personality and your temperament. Like, so
Yeah,
it's really hard and kind of confusing to really know what role it really plays.
that's
But
exactly it. That is my whole take. There are methods to sort these things out, and to some extent we can employ them in some areas, but not others. So in research, we have access to what are called experimental designs. And in experimental designs, we take a group of people and we randomly assign them to at least two, or if not more, conditions that are exactly the same, except for one critical feature. And what that critical feature is can depend, but in this case, it would be exposing them to porn or not exposing them to porn, to see then how they respond as a consequence. And the benefit of random assignment to condition is that it makes both groups equivalent with all in terms of all of those underlying factors,
yes,
right? So we can't do a study about rape, for example. Like we can't take people that we should be very worried about and randomly give them porn or not to see if they go out and rape people in the world. We can't and should never do that study. But there are other studies we can do. And one of the things that I think the research field has been remiss on is not doing enough experiments in the areas in which we can actually do experiments. And so one of the first forays I had into the porn field was on this notion of sexual imitation. A lot of people are concerned about sexual imitation. I was just reading an article the other day about people freaking out about the rise of choking porn and the rise of choking in sexual relationships. And how porn must be causing that. Incidentally, choking was in relationships long before it was in porn, but that's a whole other thing. We can't test like imitation of choking, but we can test the imitation of something that might potentially benefit a relationship, right? And so for my master's thesis, I got a bunch of women and exposed them to porn in which the women stimulated their clitoris or did not stimulate their clitoris during partnered sexual activity to see if women would then imitate that behavior. And if they did, the likely consequences of that would be improved sexual pleasure, satisfaction, and potentially orgasm. And so we can do those sorts of studies where if there is a causal effect of porn, it's likely to enhance a person's life rather than take away from it. And that's really where, research should be focusing its attention. And generally, aside from me and two or three other people, it's not, which I think is a terrible tragedy.
well, thank you so much for coming on to kind of break down what's going on with pornography and research, because right now there is a lot of, there's a lot of I don't want to say the word hype, because they can be correct about
Mhm.
porn usage and its effects, but at the same time there needs to be some you got to pump the brakes a little bit, because we really don't know. You know what I mean? You could be attacking the wrong things and all of these things. It's more complicated. It's more nuanced, as a lot of research is. So thank you for breaking that down and explaining all the details of why
Mhm.
this doesn't automatically mean that A doesn't automatically equal to B or whatever. Like,
Yeah,
thank you.
yeah,
Thank you so
you're welcome. My pleasure.
Yeah, so what do you have going on now? What are your plans now? Are you still trying to convince
Yeah,
people
so
to
Sorry, I keep interrupting you.
Mm.
I have recently moved back to Canada, started a new position at a new university, and trying to juggle that with the research commitments I've made. Currently, alongside of that, I'm still running a very large scale effort to sort of replicate some of the research we've talked about today about couples and similarity and dissimilarity in porn use and shared porn use. We're trying to recruit a sample of 1,200 couples. Up until now, we've been analyzing couples samples around 200 couples each, which is pretty sizable, but we want to do better. And we also want to examine how this plays out in same-sex relationships, which is completely ignored in the porn field. So we're trying to recruit a huge number of gay and lesbian relationships to mixed success. We've got about 600 couples in the bag. We still need another 600. And then after that, the plan is to start doing some experiments with couples where we modify people's porn use in ways that we think will enhance the relationship to see if we can find causal effects in the same sort of vein that I was talking about. The first study will simply be like porn dates. So we will randomly assign couples to have, we should call it Netflix and chill probably. Uh, Once a week, get together, watch a movie from this list, right? And just go about your life as you do. And then another set of couples to do the same thing, but with a set of porn videos, and then track to see, are there
Yeah.
any changes in the relationship dynamics over time? And if so, those changes, according to our intuitions and the best available evidence from descriptive and correlational studies, should be positive. And if nothing happens, then it suggests that maybe there's another reason, and you alluded to it. It could be that there's a positive relationship between sexual satisfaction and shared porn use, because people who are in good relationships are more likely and open to sharing porn use with their partner than people who are in struggling, conflicted relationships that have lower sexual satisfaction to begin with. So it could be that it's the sexual satisfaction driving the shared porn use and not vice versa, right?
I
Or it
was
could be
actually
something
gonna
else altogether.
ask you
Yeah,
that.
exactly.
So I'm
Well,
glad you
you
brought
hinted
that up.
at it. You said something to that effect actually when you brought it up at some point. So yeah, you're absolutely right. It could be that way, and the only way we can figure out whether or not porn is causing sexual satisfaction is through an experimental design like that. So we're going to try that one out. And then if we get through that one, we have another one where we're going to try and recruit couples who are dissimilar in their porn use and make them more similar in their porn use by making the porn user decrease their porn use. If everybody's right and porn is destroying relationships, then decreasing porn use should make the relationship better, right? Nobody
That's
has run that study yet.
oh,
How
I
crazy
mean,
is that?
that is kind of common sense. So Dr. Kahoot, if a couple comes in to therapy,
Yeah.
based off of porn research and they have relationship problems,
Mm-hmm.
porn may not fix it, and porn may
Mm-hmm.
not. Basically, in a nutshell, porn may not fix it, and porn may not make it. It may not be what's making it worse.
Yeah, no, that's exactly it. In fact, I was interviewing for a job once and doing, a shortened version of this talk. Um, and one of the faculty members, a clinical psychologist who did couples therapy, just commented like, yeah, whenever couples come into my practice with a porn issue, it's never actually about the porn. It's always about something else more fundamental, and they're focusing on porn rather than dealing with their underlying relationship issues. Now, I'm not a clinician. I can't say that from personal experience, but I've had clinicians tell me this.
Gotcha. Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much. We got to stay in touch. I definitely would love to see.
Yeah, no problem. I'd love to do a redo if you want to do a follow up in a year or whatever.